Good morning. Today we're going to start our chapter on lipids. And so in this chapter we will be discussing the roles of body fat, the chemist's view of lipids, the health effects and recommended intakes of fats in the body, fats in foods, and in the nutrition and practice we'll be talking about figuring out fats, which includes identifying which fats support health and which fats may in fact impair health. So let's get started. So most people know that too much fat in the diet imposes health risks, but you might be surprised to find that too little fat in the diet also has the same effect. Unfortunately, in the United States, though, we are more likely to overeat too much fat as opposed to have too little fat in the diet. However, we will explore what happens on both aspects of that spectrum. So before we get into the roles of fat in the body, let's talk about some terms. So fat is a member of the family called lipids, and there are several different types of lipids that we find in foods and in the human body. And there are three types that we're going to focus on in this chapter. The first one are triglycerides, and these are primarily fats and oils that we find in foods and in the diet. There are also phospholipids and sterols, which are a different class of fats. Some of them we get in food, but we primarily find these in cell membranes and in cholesterol. So we'll talk about them a little bit more later. Okay, so let's talk about the roles of body fat. Why do we need body fat? Oftentimes, fat is one of those things that people say, oh, you need to avoid it, you don't want any in your diet, and while you don't want too much, just like everything else that we have discussed, you need a nice healthy balance of this in your body. The primary function of lipids in the body is to provide the body with energy. And as a matter of fact, fat storage actually supplies about 60% of our body's energy needs when we are at rest. During activity and when we are up and moving, carbohydrates are our body's primary source of energy and the preferred source of energy. So as we're up and moving throughout the day, we are putting fuel in our bodies in the form of predominantly carbohydrates, and then we are also burning that off as we move throughout the day and as we are active. But at night, when we are not sleeping and we are not taking in energy to be burned immediately, our body still needs energy to survive and perform its vital functions. And so this is where fat comes into play. And so any excess fat that's stored in our body is burned off for energy during periods of rest and inactivity, or during long periods where we are either fasting or where we could potentially be going through periods of starvation. So that is how the body uses fat for energy. It is also worth noting, though, just to reiterate, we did learn in chapter 2 that the brain and nerves do need glucose exclusively for energy. And so while the rest of our body might be able to get away with using fat storage for energy, we still need to be taking in a certain amount of carbohydrates and filling up some of our glycogen stores so that our brain and nervous system can function off of that glucose. Okay, so let's talk about the actual storage of this body fat and how it compares to carbohydrate storage. The primary difference is that the body's capacity to store fat for energy is almost unlimited. And so this fat is stored in our adipose tissue and in our adipose cells. And so what happens is these cells will swell as we take in more fat from our diet, and that fat will exit the bloodstream and enter into these adipose cells. And they'll take in so much, but then as they get over full or overcrowded and they're at capacity, these adipose cells have the ability to grow in size and swell and expand. in your head, you should be envisioning maybe the belly kind of expanding and swelling. We know that people who consume too much fat in their diet tend to wear their fat around their midsection and in their thighs, and these are predominantly the adipose cells that tend to swell and enlarge, and that's why we end up with these kind of enlarged abdomens when we overeat too much fat in our diets. So how does that differ from carbohydrates? So glycogen stores, which is the body's storage form of glucose, which we learned last chapter. So when we take in too much glucose, our body converts that glucose into glycogen and it stores it in the liver and the muscles. That storage, though, is limited in its capacity. It can only hold, the liver and the muscles can only hold so much glycogen, and then the rest of the excess glucose has to either be burned off or it continues to circulate in the bloodstream where it can be detrimental, as we talked a little bit about last chapter. And so glycogen stores have a certain capacity, and we can only store so much of it, whereas body fat storage is virtually unlimited. Okay. In addition to storage, though, these fat cells also secrete hormones. And these hormones help to regulate appetite and also influence some other body functions. So before we talk about some other roles of fat in the body, visually, this is what we're talking about with that adipose cell. This is an adipose cell, okay? Here is the cell membrane and the nucleus, and here is the actual fat cell or adipose cell itself. What I want you to see from this image is this is the muscle, and you have a little connective tissue, which is the blue here. And then down in here, this red and blue represents the capillary bed. All right, and so if you know anything about anatomy, these are our small arterial capillaries, and these are our small venular capillaries, which is where blood exchange, nutrient exchange, and oxygen and oxygen and carbon dioxide gas exchange also occurs down in these capillary beds. We're going to focus on the nutrient exchange. So the arterioles are dropping off nutrients to the cells in these capillary beds. And in this instance, fat is going to be dropped off out of the bloodstream and into the capillary beds. And what you see down here is the lipids from the bloodstream are going to enter into the adipose cell. Now, if we're in normal balance, these lipids will enter the bloodstream, and then as we're burning energy, those lipids will then exit into the blood where they can be taken to other cells and tissues like our muscles to be burned for energy. However, when we have an energy imbalance, we end up having more and more lipids enter the bloodstream than are leaving it. And so what happens is this cell here is just going to grow and enlarge and swell and will gradually become bigger and bigger, and eventually it will start to bulge out, and we'll be able to actually see us wearing this excess fat physically from the external aspect of our body. Okay. So moving on and talking about some other functions of fat in the body. So we talked about the energy storage. We talked about it being used as a muscle fuel. And let me hit on that just a little bit more as far as burning it for fuel. So like we said, our brain and nervous system requires exclusively glucose, and so we still need to make sure we're always getting in some type of carbohydrate. However, if we go through long periods of glucose deprivation, which can be either fasting or starvation, and again, it's important to point out here that our body, our physical body, does not know whether we are choosing to fast or whether it is not our choice and we are going through a period of starvation. Either way, what is physically happening in the body is the same. And so I just want you to realize that so if we talk about periods of starvation and that doesn't relate to you, or you talk about periods of fasting and that doesn't relate to you, either way, physically what is happening in the body is the exact same thing. Okay, so when we go through long periods of glucose deprivation, so what happens is our body develops the ability to derive some of our energy from a special form of fat, which is known as ketones. So we still need the glucose, like we said, but what this means is that people who are wanting to lose weight need to eat a minimum amount of carbohydrates to meet their energy needs, even when they're limiting their food intakes. However, if you are getting just the right amounts and you're eating a high fat diet, your body will be able to convert that fat into ketones and burn those ketones for energy. And maybe you have heard of the keto diet, which is very popular right now. That's essentially how the keto diet works. I don't want to get into more details on that right now. I just want you to realize that there is a way for the body to use this fat as energy when carbohydrates are not present. Okay. So moving on, down here, padding. So fat functions as padding, as an inside layer of protection for our internal body organs. It also serves as insulation. It helps insulate against extreme body temperatures by having this fat layer right underneath of our skin. We all have that fat layer there. Some of us have a thinner fat layer than others. Those of us that have thinner fat layers tend to have more trouble regulating body temperature and keeping our bodies warm. And so thinner fat layers tend to mean that individuals tend to feel colder more frequently, whereas those of us that have thicker fat layers underneath the skin tend to feel warmer and are hot more frequently because that fat acts as a thermal insulator, and so inside our body temperature is much warmer than those that have thinner fat layers. All right, so the cell membranes, these are fats that form the major material of cell membranes, and those fats are the phospholipids and the sterile cholesterols, and they maintain the structure and the health of cells. We'll talk about those a little bit more later. Other functions of fat in the body are natural oils. So these natural oils that we find in our skin, they help to give our skin a radiant complexion. Natural oils that are found in our scalp help to nourish our hair and to make it glossy. As far as padding and protection, so while it protects our internal body cavities, women also tend to have a little bit more fat than men, and there is a soft fat that is found in women's breast, which is primarily there as a protection for the mammary glands so that they don't get damaged and that women can use them for nourishment of babies. And then lastly, fats can be raw materials in the body. Some fats can be converted into other compounds like hormones or bile or vitamin D as the body needs. So as you can see here, fats tend to be very versatile in their functions and have a lot of roles in the body. Okay, I'm going to pause here and I will do another video segment on the chemist's view of lipids.